So today is the 27th of May and it is the feast day of St. Melangell, or at least one of her feast days. She sort of has two. The 27th is the date that Catholics, Orthodox and most Anglicans commemorate her, but the 31st of January has also been associated with her too. As a way of celebrating her feast days, I want you to come with me on a journey to an isolated part of the Welsh countryside, where I will tell you her story and also speak a little of the fascinating architectural and archaeological legacy that pilgrimage to her shrine has left behind. I will also say something, for those of you who have never had the privilege of visiting her shrine, what that experience is like. Now, I've been there on 3 occasions now, and each time it has been an absolutely unforgettable experience. So I want to share some of that experience with you. So, to get our bearings as we head to her shrine, let's begin our journey in the small town of Bala in Gwynedd. It's as good a place to start as any. Now, we head south out of the great metropolis that is Bala into the countryside along the B4391. And after about 13 miles travelling with big hills looming on either side of us, we reach the tiny village of Llangunnog. At this point, we then leave the main road and we head off down a narrow lane that follows the course of a stream called Afon Pennant that eventually flows into the River Severn. It's one of the tributaries of the Severn. And this narrow lane leads about 2 or 3 miles into a valley that is called Cwm Pennant. As you drive along and enter this remote valley, you increasingly feel that you're journeying into another world, perhaps even into part of Tolkien's Middle-earth. And this otherworldly Welsh valley has been associated with a legend that could come straight out of Tolkien's pen. The story goes that at Mule de Mule, which is a hill that looms over the valley, there once lived a giant called Berwyn. Now, as you travel down the lane into the valley, which has been carved out by a glacier during the last ice age, it becomes deeper and increasingly enclosed. On my first visit to this place, on a rather damp August day 4 years ago with my eldest son, the trees on the valley sides and the bare top of Mule de Mule were only occasionally visible through the mist, all of which added to the wonderful ethereal feel to the place. After a couple of miles, praying that you don't meet another vehicle on the way, you reach your destination, an isolated and hidden hamlet with just a couple of houses, a farm and an ancient parish church. For nearly 1500 years, the church in this valley has been a place of pilgrimage, for this is the secluded spot where St. Melangell, otherwise known in Latin as St. Monacella, lived her life. She lived her life, it seems, in a cave just below Mule de Mule, which is known as St. Melangell's Couch. Sadly, it's on private land, and you can only visit if you are either audacious or have permission. I am not audacious, and I have never had permission. Melangell was buried when she died, as we will see, where the parish church now is. The parish church is set in a circular churchyard, which is always a sign of ancientness and is surrounded by yews that may very well be 2,000 years old and almost certainly witnessed Melangell's presence there, which I think is just a really extraordinary thought. Who then was St. Melangell or St. Monacella? The earliest written record we have of her hagiography is a very short life of her, dating from the end of the 15th century, which only comes down to us today through a number of different transcriptions that were made in the 1570s and 1580s. The hagiography tells us this, that in the year 604, the king of Powys, who was called Brochwel Isgigroth, found himself in this secluded valley of Cwm Pennant. He was coursing hares with his hounds. During the chase, the hounds disappeared into the undergrowth, and when he followed them, Brochwel found himself in the middle of a bramble bush, face to face with St. Melangell, who is described in the life as a virgin, beautiful in appearance. The hair Brockwell had been coursing was resting under the hem of St. Melangell's garment, and as he ordered his hounds to dispatch the hare, they ran away in the opposite direction, howling. In the one medieval image we have of her, more on that later, and in the modern iconography she is always shown with a hare in remembrance of this event. Brockwell asked St. Melangell who she was, and she replied that she was the daughter of an Irish king, and that God had led her across the Irish Sea to Pennant 15 years previously to escape from an arranged marriage. She said that the king was the first man she had seen in all that time, and that she was in Cwm Pennant, living in seclusion so that she could remain spotless and devote her life to Christ. Brockwell was so impressed by her piety that he granted to her the land she was living on and confirmed for her sanctuary rights in the place. The life concludes by telling us that she remained in Cwm Pennant until her death 37 years later, having established a monastic community of women there. There is only one piece of art from before the 20th century that portrays Melangell, and it is in the church. It dates from the 15th century, from much of the time the life of her was written, and is the breastsomme, the bottom beam supporting the late medieval roodloft. On it is carved a version of the central part of her story. We see Melangell seated in the centre on a rock, perhaps, in a bramble bush, dressed as an abbess and holding a crozier, a pastoral staff. Brockwell Isigroff, the King of Powys, is shown on his horse to her right, and a dog coursing a hare to her left. Over the course of the past 100 years or so, the fabric of this ancient church has offered up much more evidence of Melangell's saintly cult. It was long realised that the plan of the church was really rather unusual, consisting of a west tower, a nave and a chancel. To the east of the chancel was something very unusual, a further rectangular chamber. This appeared to be primarily 17th century, and it was used until the 20th century as the Sunday school room. But despite that use, it seems it was always known locally as the Celi Beth, the cell of the grave. There were also lots of rather curious and elaborately carved stones built into the exterior walls of the church and even into the lich gate at the churchyard entrance, which were recognised at the end of the 19th century to be part of an elaborate tomb or shrine. An archaeologist called Robert Heaton conducted an excavation below the floor of the 17th century Celi Beth in September 1958 and made a rather astonishing discovery. Under the 17th century cell were the foundations of a much earlier structure with a rounded apse. The apse had a cobbled floor, and the floor was interrupted only by a single stone-lined grave covered by a massive slate-like stone, a stone that measured 5.5 foot by 2.5 foot. It seems that this rounded apse was constructed with one purpose, to shelter this grave, and who else could be the occupant but St. Melangell? About this time, all the sculptured stones were removed from the church walls, and it was concluded that they were the remains of the shrine, and that they had once contained the relics of St. Melangell. They really are extraordinary pieces of sculpture. Many of them are sculptured with patterns that look like brambles. An attempt was made in 1959 to reconstruct the shrine, and the final result was placed in the now empty Celi Beth. By the 1980s, the Celi Beth was feeling its years, and a decision was made in 1989 to demolish it, and reconstruct it on its original apsidal foundations. As part of that process, another archaeologist, Mr. Britnell, undertakes a further excavation. And it's during this process that a round-headed Norman door is discovered connecting the Celibeth to the chancel and suggesting a 12th century date for the apse. Rather than being in the centre of the wall, this door is offset to the north so that it doesn't interrupt that important grave. The sculptured shrine fragments were also from the 12th century, and it seems that the Celibeth and the shrine were both part of a coordinated attempt to embellish a cult, without doubt that of St. Melangell. As well as reconstructing the Celibeth on the old foundations, the shrine was reconstructed again from the fragments, and this time placed directly behind the high altar in the chancel, which people at the time thought was likely to be its original position. Quite a number of medieval shrines of saints occupied such a prominent place. The fragments were interpreted as a shrine with a raised feretory, a box on the top, and it was concluded that Melangell's remains were at some point taken from the grave and enshrined within the raised feretory, as most relics of saints were similarly raised in medieval Britain. That is how things appear today. The shrine is still behind the high altar, and from there you can then enter the Celibeth with its cobbled floor, into which is set the original slate stone over that early stone-lined grave. In 1958, Robert Heaton finds what he describes as fragments of human remains, both within the grave fill and also scattered to some degree on the cobbled floor. There was some evidence, he says, that the grave had been disturbed, but not with the sort of care that takes place when a saint is reverently exhumed and translated to a new shrine. Although we can't be 100% certain, these are probably the remains of the original occupant of this grave, St. Melangell. Now, I've heard a rumour in the circles that I mix in, I'm not going to tell you who told me this rumour, that Robert Heaton's archaeological report rather understates the matter, and it was a little more than simply fragments that were found in this grave, but a large proportion of the skeleton of a woman, and that the relics found are now encased within the reconstructed shrine. That's rather intriguing. Finding remains still in the grave, however significant those remains were, does set the cat among the pigeons when it comes to the interpretation of the shrine fragments and the original form of that structure. A shrine is undoubtedly what those fragments were, but there's no good reason to believe that it was a shrine with a raised feretory. Recent scholarship has suggested that rather than containing the relics of St. Melangell, this 12th century shrine structure was a canopy that was erected directly over the grave in the Celibeth. This explains the lack of base stones remaining, as the original shrine had no base. The original stone covering of Melangell's grave, the large slaty stone, was simply left in place and the canopy placed over the top of it. Such a canopy would still enable the faithful to get close to her relics in the tight confines of the Celibeth, and also add honour to the shrine. That also explains why the door is offset to the north in the 12th century Celibeth. It is to ensure there is room for that 12th century canopy. I find this by far the most plausible suggestion. Now, we know that at the Reformation, the remains of the shrine were dismantled and reused as building stone, and we can assume that when this took place, the grave itself was partially disturbed, which will account for the scattering of remains across the floor, the cobbled floor of the Celibeth. Documentary evidence of cultic activity focused on St. Melangell's shrine is scanty, but sufficient survives to deduce that it was an active pilgrimage centre during the Middle Ages. In the 12th century, the time the Celibeth and the shrine are constructed, St. Melangell is listed among the saints of Wales in the Bonethy Sant, the Descent of the Saints. In the early 15th century poems of Gutter Glyn, A pilgrimage to St Melangell is suggested as a destination for those who are seeking healing for various ailments. In his will of the 19th of June 1526, Sir Morgan Herbert sent his servant Howell Gethin on pilgrimage on his behalf, giving him his very own black cloth gown to wear. Among the various shrines he was to visit and to make an offering was that of St Melangell, to which he was to offer 4d. 9 years later, the Valor Ecclesiasticus of 1535 lists among the income of the rectory of Cwm Pennant oblationes ad reliquias, offerings at the relics. That year, 1535, the offerings of pilgrims to the shrine of St Melangell added up to the not insubstantial sum of £2, 16 shillings and 8d. That's around £10,000 in modern money. That's all the factual stuff. There is so much evidence, documentary, architectural, archaeological, of St Melangell's cult in Cwm Pennant, and her relics seem to be still here. But what about how it feels to go there? With that respect, I can only speak for myself. Firstly, I would say that Pennant Melangell is an extraordinary place of resurrection. For 500 years following the Reformation, Melangell was sleeping quietly in her valley. Who would have thought that 1400 years after her death that she would be discovered so dramatically, her shrine reconstructed, and pilgrimage would start again? This is a place rebuilt from fragments, and today the whole charism of this place is that of pilgrimage. I found that Pennant Melangell has a spiritual power unlike any other place I've really been to. The name of the valley itself is very apt. It accurately reflects just how this place feels. The Welsh name Cwm Pennant means valley at the source of the stream, and some distance from the church is a waterfall, and this is the source of the Afon Tanat, the little river that waters the valley. Just as the water dramatically cascades from those falls and flows into the calm of the Afon Tanat, in my experience, a spiritual waterfall of grace flows from St Melangell's shrine here and provides for the pilgrim a source of spiritual refreshment and enrichment. What I have found in Pennant Melangell in my pilgrimages to this extraordinary place is a source of living water. Melangell is in many respects a distant figure in history, yet here in her place she is very much alive and present, as alive and present as the ancient yews in the churchyard. It's though time and the division between this reality and the next is completely meaningless on the holy ground of Cwm Pennant. Whether you find your way to this place as a curious antiquarian or you make a pilgrimage in faith, I do recommend that you visit. Thanks very much for watching.